I'll never forget that rainy November afternoon. I was standing outside a grocery store, staring blankly at my phone, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. But it wasn't. I'd just gotten off a call with my landlord who, kindly, informed me that if I didn't pay my overdue rent by the end of the week, I'd be out on the street. To make matters worse, my car was in the shop, my credit card was maxed out, and payday was still 2 weeks away. I had no idea what to do. As I walked into the store, I noticed a man sitting by the entrance. He had a weathered look, scruffy beard, patched jacket, and a cardboard sign that read, "Just trying to get by. God bless." I would have just kept walking, but something in his eyes caught me off guard. They weren't filled with pity or desperation like I might have expected. They were warm, kind, like he was the one offering something, not asking for it. I gave him a small, awkward nod as I walked in, guilt pooling in my chest. Here I was, barely keeping it together, but I still felt luckier than him. What did that say about me? 15 minutes later, I walked out with a few groceries and a lump in my throat. I tried to ignore him as I passed by, but his voice stopped me. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said. I turned, ready for the usual request for spare change, but instead, he held out a plastic bag. Inside was a loaf of bread and a pack of bottled water. "You look like you're having a tough day," he said with a small smile. "I've been there. Take this. It's not much, but it's something." I froze. For a second, I didn't know if I should laugh, cry, or argue. Here was a man who clearly had nothing to spare, offering me what little he had. I wanted to refuse, but the sincerity in his voice stopped me. "Why?" I finally managed to ask. He shrugged like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Because it looks like you need it." I stood there, staring at the bag like it was a live grenade. I didn't know what to say. Every instinct screamed at me to give it back. I mean, what kind of person takes food from a homeless man? But the way he held it out, steady, almost insistent, made it clear he wasn't taking no for an answer. "Look," I started. "This is really kind, but I can't." "You can," he interrupted, his tone firm but gentle. "I've learned that sometimes you just have to let people help you. It doesn't mean you're weak. It just means you're human." That stopped me in my tracks. How many times had I refused help because of pride? How often had I bottled things up, pretending I had it all together while inside I was barely hanging on? His words hit harder than I wanted to admit. Still, I couldn't do it. "Seriously?" I said, shaking my head. "You probably need this more than I do." He chuckled, a light, almost musical sound that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. "Lady, you don't know me. I'm doing just fine." I raised an eyebrow, glancing at his sign and the thin blanket draped over his knees. "Yeah, sure you are." He shrugged again, the same easy movement as before. "Life ain't about what you have. It's about what you give. And right now, I'm giving this to you. So take it. Please." The word please did me in. It wasn't a request, it was a plea. Not for me to take the food, but for me to trust him, to believe in his intentions. So, with shaky hands, I took the bag. "Thank you," I said softly, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and guilt. "Really?" He smiled like I just made his day. "No problem. And hey, don't let the world get you down. You'll get through it. We all do." As I walked away, the bag clutched tightly in my hands. I couldn't help but glance back. He was already settling back into his spot, pulling his blanket tighter against the cold. Something about the whole thing didn't sit right with me. This man, who had next to nothing, had shown me more kindness in 5 minutes than I'd experienced in months. And what had I done for him? Nothing. That realization stayed with me all night. It was like a splinter in my mind, impossible to ignore. I didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning. That man, his name I'd later learn was Carl, was about to change my life in ways I could never have imagined. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the bag of groceries Carl had given me. It wasn't much. A loaf of white bread, a pack of bottled water, and a couple of granola bars, but it felt heavier than gold. Every time I looked at it, I thought about his face, his warm smile, and his insistence that I take it. But the guilt wouldn't leave me alone. How could I have walked away without doing anything for him? Sure, I'd been in a tough spot, but I still had a roof over my head, food in my fridge, what little there was, and a few people I could call if I really needed help. Carl didn't seem to have any of that. He was out there, in the cold, with only a thin blanket and a cardboard sign to his name. The more I thought about it, the more it gnawed at me. By the time I crawled into bed, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to let this sit. The next day, I was going back to that grocery store. I didn't know what I'd say or do, but I knew I had to see him again. I had to give something back. The morning came quickly, and I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in weeks. After a quick breakfast, I grabbed a $20 bill, pretty much all I could spare, and headed to the store. But when I got there, Carl wasn't in his usual spot. His blanket was gone, his sign was nowhere to be seen, and the bench he'd been sitting on was empty. I stood there for a few minutes, unsure of what to do. Had he moved on? Was he okay? The city was a big place. If he wasn't here, how would I ever find him? Finally, I went inside the store, hoping someone might know him. "Excuse me," I said to the cashier, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes. "Do you know the guy who usually sits out front?" Older, with a beard. Her face softened. "Oh, you mean Carl? Yeah, he's around sometimes. Comes and goes. Why, you looking for him?" I nodded. "I just wanted to thank him. He helped me out yesterday, and I wanted to return the favor." The woman smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "That's Carl for you. Always helping people even when he's got nothing himself. If you're lucky, you might catch him in the park a few blocks over. He likes to sit by the fountain." The park. I knew the one she was talking about. It wasn't far. Clutching the 20 in my pocket, I headed there, determined to find him. What I didn't realize was that this search would lead to a far bigger journey than I'd anticipated. The park wasn't as inviting as I'd hoped. The November wind had picked up, scattering leaves across the walkways and biting through my jacket. The fountain in the center, once a picturesque spot in the summer, now looked forlorn, its water sluggish and gray under the overcast sky. I scanned the benches around the fountain, my heart sinking with every empty seat I passed. I couldn't see Carl anywhere. The park wasn't huge, but there were enough nooks and pathways to make finding one person feel impossible. I started wandering aimlessly, my eyes darting to every figure I saw. A man feeding pigeons by the pond? No, not him. A couple jogging on the trail? Definitely not. I was starting to feel foolish. What was I even doing? Chasing down a homeless man because I couldn't handle the weight of his generosity? Maybe I should just go home. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I spotted a figure huddled under a tree near the edge of the park. He was sitting cross-legged, his head bent low, a familiar tattered blanket wrapped around his shoulders. It was Carl. I felt a wave of relief, followed immediately by nerves. What was I going to say? "Hey, thanks for the bread. Here's $20? Felt so inadequate, so transactional, compared to what he'd done for me. But I couldn't turn back now. Taking a deep breath, I made my way toward him. As I got closer, I noticed he wasn't just sitting there idly. He had a small, spiral notebook open on his lap and was scribbling something with a pen. His focus was intense, his brow furrowed as if he were solving a puzzle. I hesitated, not wanting to interrupt, but he must have sensed me because he looked up. "Hey there," he said, his voice carrying the same warmth as before. "Didn't expect to see you again." I smiled, though my nerves were making it hard to hold eye contact. "Hi, Carl. I wanted to thank you for yesterday." He shrugged, like it was no big deal. "No need for that. Just glad I could help." "No, really?" I said, pulling the 20 out of my pocket and holding it out to him. "I mean it. Please take this. It's not much, but—" He held up his hand, stopping me mid-sentence. "Keep it," he said firmly. "You probably need it more than I do." I stared at him, stunned. "What? No, I don't. Carl, you're—" I gestured to his blanket and the notebook in his lap, my words failing me. I'm fine, he said simply. Money's just paper. What you needed yesterday wasn't bread or water. You needed someone to care. That's worth more than this, he added, tapping the 20 with a finger. I didn't know what to say. My throat tightened, and I felt the beginnings of tears stinging my eyes. How could someone who had so little be so wise, so selfless? I sat down beside him, unable to leave, even though I had no idea what I was supposed to do next. And that's when he surprised me again. You ever written before? He asked, holding up his notebook. Written, I repeated, confused. Like, stories? Yeah, he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. Everyone's got a story worth telling. Even you. I blinked at him, caught off guard by the question. I mean, not really, I said. Maybe in school a long time ago, but nothing like stories. Carl nodded thoughtfully, tapping the pen against the edge of the notebook. Doesn't matter. You don't have to be good at it. Sometimes, just getting it out helps. I tilted my head, curiosity growing. Is that what you're doing? Writing your story? He chuckled, a low, warm sound. Something like that. It's not much, just bits and pieces. Helps me remember the good stuff, you know? Sometimes it feels like the bad tries to take over. This, he held up the notebook, keeps it in check. I glanced at the open page, trying not to be obvious. His handwriting was cramped and uneven, but I could make out a few words. She smiled at me like she meant it, followed by a short line I couldn't quite read. What kind of stuff do you write about? I asked, genuinely curious now. Carl shrugged, a small, wistful smile tugging at his lips. People I've met, things I've seen, little moments that stick with me. You'd be surprised how much beauty there is, even when life's got you on the ropes. Something about the way he said it made my chest ache. Here was a man with every reason to be bitter or angry, yet he sat under a tree, writing about beauty. It was humbling in a way I wasn't prepared for. What about you? He asked suddenly, turning the spotlight back on me. What's your story? I laughed nervously, unsure of how to answer. Oh, trust me, it's not that interesting. Just the usual work, bills, trying to keep my head above water. Carl leaned back against the tree, studying me with a thoughtful expression. Funny thing is, that's what most people say. But everyone's story gets interesting once you dig a little deeper. I wasn't sure what he was getting at, but something in his tone made me pause. Maybe he was right. Maybe there was more to my life than the daily grind I was so focused on. But even if there was, how could I put it into words? Carl seemed to sense my hesitation. Tell you what, he said, tearing a page from his notebook and handing it to me along with the pen. Write something. Anything. Doesn't have to be perfect. Just start. I hesitated, staring at the blank page. The pen felt awkward in my hand, like it belonged to someone else. I don't even know where to begin, I admitted. Begin anywhere, Carl said. That's the secret. You just have to start. It was such a simple piece of advice, but something about the way he said it made it feel profound. Taking a deep breath, I put the pen to the page and wrote the first thing that came to mind. I don't know what I'm doing, but maybe that's okay. Carl peered at it, grinning. That's a pretty good start. I sat there, staring at the sentence I'd written. It wasn't much, just a simple truth, but it felt like more than I'd expected. Something about putting it down on paper made it real, like I'd taken the first step toward understanding myself in a way I hadn't before. Carl leaned over, reading the words again. You know, most people think they need to have it all figured out before they start something. But sometimes, not knowing is what makes the story worth telling. I smiled faintly, tracing the edge of the paper with my thumb. Easy for you to say. You seem to have this whole perspective thing figured out. He laughed, a deep, hearty sound that caught me off guard. Figured out? Lady, I'm just trying to keep from losing my marbles half the time. But when you've been through enough, you learn to look for the good stuff. It's the only thing that keeps you sane. I thought about that for a moment. Maybe that was what I'd been missing. Lately, my life had felt like one long list of things going wrong, one after another. I couldn't remember the last time I'd stopped to look for anything good. So, what's next? Carl asked, nodding toward the notebook. Gonna keep writing? Or is that the end of your debut? I laughed, the sound surprising me with its ease. I guess I could write a little more, but I'm not sure what to say. Write about yesterday, he suggested. Start with that. What were you thinking when you walked into that grocery store? What made you stop? What did you feel when you left? It was such a simple prompt, but it hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't really thought about how I'd felt in that moment, how overwhelmed and defeated I'd been, and how Carl's kindness had jolted me out of it. I hadn't let myself process it. So I started writing, slowly at first, then with more ease as the words began to flow. I wrote about the rain, the weight of my landlord's ultimatum, the guilt of leaving my wallet behind. And then I wrote about Carl. His voice, his words, and the way his kindness had pierced through my fog of hopelessness. By the time I looked up, my hand ached, and Carl was watching me with a satisfied smile. See? He said. Told you everyone's got a story. I handed the notebook back to him, feeling oddly lighter, like I just unloaded a backpack full of bricks. Thanks, I said, for this, for everything. Carl waved me off. Don't thank me yet. You're just getting started. I walked away from the park that afternoon with Carl's words echoing in my head. You're just getting started. There was something about the way he said it that stuck with me, like he knew something I didn't. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel stuck. I felt curious about my own story, about his, about what might happen if I let myself lean into the unknown. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Every time I sat down, I found myself reaching for a notebook I hadn't touched in years. I'd scribble down thoughts, memories, random bits of dialogue that popped into my head. It was messy and unorganized, but it felt good, almost cathartic. And it wasn't just the writing. I started noticing things I'd ignored before. The little boy on my street who helped his grandma carry groceries. The woman at work who always brought donuts on Fridays. Small acts of kindness that I'd overlooked because I was too caught up in my own problems. I realized something. Carl wasn't just writing about beauty because it made him feel better. He was writing about it because it was everywhere if you just knew how to look. By the end of the week, I knew I had to see him again. There were so many questions I hadn't asked. Why did he start writing? What was his story? And why, of all people, had he chosen to help me that day? I went back to the park, my notebook in hand this time. I wasn't sure if he'd be there. It felt like a gamble. But as soon as I rounded the corner by the fountain, I spotted him. He was sitting in the same spot under the tree, his notebook balanced on his knee. When he saw me, his face lit up with a grin. Back for more? He teased. I laughed, holding up my notebook. You could say that. I've been writing. Thought you might want to know. Carl's grin widened. Well, look at you turning into a regular storyteller. What did you write about? I hesitated, suddenly shy. Mostly just stuff from my life. Nothing fancy. Good, he said, gesturing for me to sit down. The best stories aren't fancy. They're honest. I lowered myself onto the grass beside him, the notebook heavy in my hands. Can I ask you something? Shoot, he said, leaning back against the tree. Why do you do it? I asked. The writing, the helping people, all of it. Carl was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting to the fountain. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than usual. Because someone did it for me once. A long time ago, when I thought I didn't have anything left to give. They saw something in me I couldn't see in myself. And it saved me. I stared at him, trying to imagine a younger version of Carl, lost and hopeless. It was hard to picture. Who was it? I asked. He smiled faintly. A stranger. Never even got their name. But I figure the best way to pay them back is to keep passing it on. Carl's words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. A stranger saved me. I couldn't help but wonder what that must have been like for him. Being in such a dark place and having someone reach out when he least expected it. Do you ever think about them? I asked softly. The person who helped you? Every day, Carl said, his eyes fixed on the fountain. I don't know who they were or where they came from, but I wouldn't be here without them. I was in a bad spot back then. Lost my job, my apartment, everything. Spent weeks wandering the streets, thinking it was over. And then one day, this person came out of nowhere. What did they do? I asked, leaning in. Carl smiled. The kind of smile that held a mix of gratitude and disbelief. It wasn't anything big. They didn't give me $1,000 or find me a place to stay. All they did was sit with me, talk to me like I was a human being, told me I still mattered, even when I didn't believe it myself. And before they left, they handed me this. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small, dog-eared book. The cover was faded, the edges frayed, but it was clear he'd kept it close for a long time. I squinted at the title, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. They said it might help me find my way, Carl continued, running his fingers over the worn cover. At first, I thought it was stupid. A book? How's that supposed to fix anything? But I was desperate, so I started reading. And you know what? It didn't fix everything, but it gave me something I hadn't had in a long time. Hope. I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat making it difficult to speak. That's incredible, Carl chuckled. Funny thing is, I tried to give it back once I finished it. I wanted them to pass it on to someone else, but they told me to keep it. Said I'd know when it was time to pay it forward. And have you? I asked, though I already knew the answer. He nodded. Plenty of times. But the thing about paying it forward is it doesn't stop with one person. Every time you help someone, it ripples out. You never know how far it'll go. I sat back, letting his words sink in. The idea that a single act of kindness could have such a far-reaching impact was both humbling and inspiring. It made me wonder about my own life, about the times I'd been helped and the times I could have done more to help others. I think I get it now, I said after a while. Why you gave me that bread. It wasn't just about helping me, was it? It was about the ripple. Carl smiled, his eyes twinkling. Now you're catching on. Carl's words stayed with me long after I left the park that day. You never know how far it'll go. I couldn't stop thinking about it. How many ripples had Carl created with his small acts of kindness? How many people had he touched without even realizing it? And what about me? Had I ever been part of a ripple I didn't know about? That night, as I sat in my apartment with my notebook open in front of me, I found myself reflecting on moments I'd long forgotten. There was the time a stranger had paid for my gas when I'd left my wallet at home. Or the time my high school teacher had stayed late to help me with a project because she believed I could do better. Small things, but looking back, they'd meant everything to me in those moments. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how often I'd been on the receiving end of someone else's ripple. But how often had I been the one to start one? That question stuck with me. It wasn't that I didn't care. I did, but I'd always assumed I didn't have enough to give. Enough money, enough time, enough energy. But Carl's story had flipped that idea on its head. Maybe it wasn't about having enough. Maybe it was about doing something, no matter how small. The next morning, I woke up with a new sense of purpose. I wasn't sure exactly what I was going to do, but I knew I had to start somewhere. And that somewhere was Carl. I went back to the park, hoping to find him in his usual spot. Sure enough, he was there, scribbling in his notebook under the same tree. When he saw me, he grinned. You're back. Thought I might have scared you off with all my philosophizing. Not a chance, I said, sitting down beside him. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something. Oh yeah, he said, raising an eyebrow. What's on your mind? I've been thinking about what you said. I began. About ripples. And I realized I want to start one. But I don't know how. Carl studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled. You already have, he said simply. I frowned, confused. What do you mean? He tapped the notebook I'd brought with me. You started writing. You started paying attention. That's all it takes. The rest will come. I wanted to argue, to tell him that wasn't enough, but something about the way he said it made me pause. Maybe he was right. Maybe the act of starting, of opening myself up to the idea, was enough to set the ripple in motion. All right, I said finally. But if I'm doing this, I want to do it right. So, what's the next step? Carl grinned, leaning back against the tree. Ah, now that's the fun part. The next step is wherever the ripple takes you. Carl's words played on repeat in my mind for the rest of the day. The next step is wherever the ripple takes you. At first, it felt frustratingly vague. I wanted a roadmap, something concrete to follow. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that wasn't the point. The ripple wasn't about planning. It was about being open to moments as they came. The next morning, I decided to pay attention, really pay attention. For the first time in a long time, I walked through my neighborhood, my notebook tucked under my arm, ready to jot down anything that caught my eye. It didn't take long before I spotted something. At the corner of my block, a man was struggling to load a large box into the trunk of his car. He was older, maybe in his 70s, and the box looked way too heavy for one person. Without thinking, I crossed the street and called out, "Do you need a hand?" The man looked up, startled, but then he smiled. I wouldn't say no. This thing's heavier than it looks. Together, we managed to wrestle the box into his trunk. When we were done, he wiped his brow and gave me a grateful nod. "Thank you. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." "It's no problem," I said, surprised by how good it felt to help. "What's in there, anyway? If you don't mind me asking." He laughed. "Books. A whole lot of them. I'm donating them to the library down the street." Something about that made me pause. "Books?" I echoed. "What kind of books?" "Oh, just old ones I don't need anymore," he said. "Novels, history, a bit of everything." "Why, you interested?" "Actually, yeah," I admitted. "I've been thinking a lot about stories lately, how they connect us." The man's face lit up. "That's exactly why I've kept so many over the years. Stories have a way of reminding us we're not alone." It was such a simple statement, but it hit me hard. Carl had said something similar, about everyone having a story worth telling. And now here was this stranger, echoing the same sentiment. I couldn't help but wonder if the ripple was already in motion. As we parted ways, I felt a strange sense of clarity. Maybe the next step wasn't something big or dramatic. Maybe it was just about noticing opportunities to connect, one small moment at a time. And maybe, just maybe, those moments would add up to something greater than I could see right now. That evening, I couldn't stop thinking about the man with the books. His words lingered in my mind. Stories have a way of reminding us we're not alone. Between him and Carl, it felt like the universe was trying to tell me something. Maybe it wasn't just about starting my own ripple. It was about noticing the ones already around me and helping them grow. The next day, I decided to visit the library where the man had donated the books. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly, but something told me I needed to go. When I arrived, the librarian, a cheerful woman in her 50s, greeted me with a warm smile. "Can I help you find something?" she asked. I hesitated, unsure how to explain. "Actually, I think some books were donated here yesterday." "A big box." The librarian nodded. "Oh yes, Mr. Talbot brought those in. Such a nice man. We've just started sorting through them. Is there something specific you're looking for?" "Not really," I admitted. "I guess I just wanted to see what he gave." She led me to a cart filled with books of all shapes and sizes. As I browsed, one caught my eye, a worn hardcover with a faded title, Small Miracles, Stories of Kindness and Connection. Something about it felt familiar, like it was meant to be there. I picked it up and flipped through the pages, skimming a few of the stories. Each one was about an act of kindness, just like the ones Carl had described, rippling out in unexpected ways. "You can check that out if you'd like," the librarian said, noticing my interest. "Thanks," I said, clutching the book to my chest. "I think I will." As I left the library, I couldn't help but smile. The book felt like a little piece of the ripple connecting Carl, the man with the books, and now me. I spent the rest of the afternoon reading it, marveling at how small actions, giving someone a ride, sharing a meal, lending an ear, could create such profound changes in people's lives. By the time I finished, I knew what I wanted to do next. Carl had inspired me to pay attention, and the book had shown me what was possible when kindness spread. Now, I wanted to take it one step further. I wanted to share these stories, Not just my own, but others, so the ripples could reach even farther. That night, I opened my notebook and started brainstorming. I didn't know exactly how it would work yet, but I was determined to find a way. Whether it was writing, speaking, or something else entirely, I wanted to keep the ripple alive. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I sat at my kitchen table, notebook open, scribbling ideas as fast as they came to me. At first, they were all over the place. Random thoughts about storytelling, kindness, and connection. But slowly, a clearer picture started to form. What if I could collect stories like Carl's and the ones from the library book? Stories of people making a difference in small but meaningful ways. What if I could share those stories with others, inspiring them to start their own ripples? The thought gave me a little thrill. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was onto something real. But how could I do it? Writing a book felt overwhelming, and I didn't have a platform to reach people. Then, as I stared at the page, it hit me: social media. Everyone was on it, and it didn't cost anything to start. I could create a blog or a page dedicated to sharing these stories. It wouldn't be fancy at first, but it could grow. Excited, I grabbed my laptop and started researching. I looked up how to start a blog, how to create engaging posts, and even how to connect with people who might have stories to share. Before I knew it, I'd spent hours planning. By the time I looked up, the sun was setting, and I realized I hadn't eaten all day. But I wasn't done yet. I needed to tell Carl about this. After all, he was the one who'd planted the seed. Without him, I wouldn't have had the courage to think beyond my own struggles. The next morning, I headed back to the park, my notebook and laptop in tow. When I found Carl under his usual tree, he looked up and grinned. "Well, if it isn't my star pupil. What's the latest?" I sat down beside him, barely able to contain my excitement. "Okay, hear me out. I've been thinking about what you said, about ripples and everyone having a story, and I want to do something with it." Carl raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Go on." "I want to start a blog," I said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "A place where people can share stories about kindness and connection. Like yours. Like the ones from that book at the library. I want to show people how small actions can make a big difference." Carl leaned back against the tree, a thoughtful expression on his face. "That's not a bad idea," he said after a moment. "But you've got to be ready. Sharing stories like that. It's powerful, but it's also a responsibility. You sure you're up for it?" I nodded, feeling a flicker of determination. "I think I am. I mean, I don't have it all figured out yet, but I want to try." Carl smiled, his eyes twinkling. "That's all you need to start. Go for it." With Carl's encouragement, I dove headfirst into building the blog. I spent hours tinkering with the design, coming up with a name, and figuring out how to write my first post. I wanted it to feel personal but also universal, something that would connect with anyone who stumbled across it. I finally settled on the name The Ripple Effect. It felt perfect, simple, meaningful, and a tribute to Carl's wisdom. My first post was about him, of course. I wrote about the day we met, how his small act of kindness had shaken me out of my fog, and the conversations that followed. I ended it with an invitation. "What's your ripple story? If you've experienced or witnessed a moment of kindness, I'd love to hear it. Let's create something beautiful together." After I hit publish, I stared at the screen, my heart racing. I had no idea if anyone would read it, let alone respond. But I reminded myself of what Carl had said. The next step is wherever the ripple takes you. The next day, I went back to the park to tell Carl about the launch. He was sitting in his usual spot, his notebook open, and when he saw me, his face lit up. "Well?" he asked. "How'd it go?" "I did it," I said, sitting down beside him. "The blog's live. I wrote about you, actually." Carl chuckled. "Me? Well, I hope you made me sound good." "You didn't need my help with that," I said, grinning. "But seriously, thank you. I wouldn't have done this without you." Carl waved me off. "Nah, you did the hard part. I just gave you a nudge." We spent the next hour talking about the blog, and Carl even offered to share some of his own stories for future posts. "I've got a few good ones tucked away," he said, tapping his notebook. Might as well put them to use. That night, I went home feeling lighter than I had in months. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, that uncertainty didn't scare me. It excited me. A few days later, something incredible happened. I got my first comment on the blog. It was from a woman named Sarah, who shared a story about a stranger who'd helped her during a medical emergency. Her words were raw and heartfelt, and by the time I finished reading, I had tears in my eyes. I replied immediately, thanking her for sharing, and soon more comments started trickling in. Each one felt like a spark, a reminder that there were so many ripples out there, waiting to be seen, and I couldn't wait to share them with the world. The blog grew faster than I ever imagined. At first, it was just a handful of comments. Stories from people like Sarah who'd been touched by kindness in unexpected ways. But within weeks, those stories turned into dozens, then hundreds. People were sharing the blog with their friends, tagging family members, and sending in stories from all over the country. Each day, I'd wake up to new submissions in my inbox. Some were short and sweet, like a stranger paying for someone's groceries. Others were longer and deeply emotional, recounting life-changing moments of compassion. No matter the size of the gesture, each story carried the same powerful message: kindness matters. Carl was thrilled when I told him about the response. "I told you," he said with a grin. "People want to feel connected. You're just giving them the space to do it." I started visiting him more often, not just to talk but to read him the stories people were sending in. He'd sit back, listening intently, occasionally nodding or murmuring his approval. "That's a good one," he'd say after hearing about a teacher who'd gone above and beyond for a struggling student, or a neighbor who'd stepped in during a tough time. But one day, as I was reading, Carl stopped me. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "there's one story you haven't written yet." I looked at him, puzzled. "Which one?" "Yours," he said simply. I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. I wrote about how we met." "That's part of it," Carl said. "But there's more to your story than that, isn't there? Why you were in that place when we met. How you've changed since. People don't just want to hear about kindness. They want to know how it transforms someone. And you're living proof." The idea made me nervous. I wasn't used to opening up like that, especially about the harder parts of my life. But Carl was right. If I wanted to inspire others, I had to be willing to share my own journey, the struggles, the doubts, and the moments that had brought me to where I was now. That night, I sat down at my laptop and started typing. I wrote about losing my job, the financial strain, and the crushing sense of failure that had followed. I wrote about how Carl's small gesture, a loaf of bread and a bottle of water, had reminded me that I wasn't alone, even when I felt like I was. And I wrote about how that moment had set me on a path I never could have imagined. It was the hardest post I'd ever written, but when I finally hit publish, I felt a strange sense of relief. It was like I'd finally let go of a weight I'd been carrying for years. The response was overwhelming. Comments poured in from people who saw themselves in my story, who'd been through their own struggles and found hope in unexpected places. For the first time, I realized the ripple wasn't just about what Carl had done for me. It was about what I could now do for others. A few weeks after sharing my story, something incredible happened. I was sitting with Carl under his usual tree in the park, reading him the latest stories from the blog, when a woman approached us. She looked nervous, clutching a piece of paper in her hand. "Excuse me," she said, her voice shaky. "Are you the one who runs the Ripple Effect?" I blinked, stunned. "Yes, that's me." Her face broke into a smile, and she held out the paper. "I just wanted to say thank you. Your blog, it helped me. I've been going through a really rough time, and reading those stories reminded me that there's still good in the world. It gave me the courage to reach out to someone I hadn't talked to in years. And now, well, things are better." Carl beamed, looking as proud as if he'd written the stories himself. "Told you this would happen," he said, nudging me with his elbow. The woman hesitated, glancing at him. "Are you, Carl?" He chuckled. "Depends who's asking." Her smile widened. "I thought so. I recognized you from the first post. You're the one who started all of this." Carl waved a hand dismissively. Nah, I didn't start anything. Just gave a little nudge. But the woman shook her head. You did more than that. Without you, none of this would exist. So, thank you. I watched as Carl's face softened, a rare vulnerability flickering in his eyes. He reached out to take her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. I'm glad I could help, he said quietly. After she left, we sat in silence for a while, the weight of the moment settling over us. Finally, Carl turned to me, his expression serious. You've done something amazing here, he said. And you're just getting started. I smiled, the words warming me in a way I couldn't explain. It's not just me, I said. It's you. It's everyone who's shared their story. We're all part of this. Carl nodded, his eyes twinkling. That's the beauty of it, isn't it? A ripple doesn't belong to one person. It belongs to everyone it touches. From that day on, the ripple effect became more than just a blog. It became a movement, a way for people to connect, to heal, and to inspire each other. And through it all, Carl remained at the heart of it, a quiet reminder of the power of kindness. Looking back, I realize now that the ripple didn't start with me. It didn't even start with Carl. It started with the stranger who gave him a book, and with whoever inspired that stranger before them. It's a chain that stretches back further than any of us can see, and forward to places we can only imagine. And that's the thing about ripples, they never really end. They just keep going, touching lives in ways we'll never fully understand. All it takes is one small act to set them in motion. Thank you for sticking with the story until the end. Let me know if you'd like help refining it or brainstorming more ideas.